Segue, to continue at once with the next musical selection or composition.
Segue, to make a transition directly from one section or theme to another.
To move smoothly and unhesitatingly from one state, situation, condition, or element to another.
Segue, to perform in the manner of the preceding section.
Segue, to make a transition from one thing to another smoothly and without interruption.
This is Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the College of Arts and Sciences at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville.
Hello everybody. Dr. Linda Markowitz was born in Dallas, Texas. She obtained her bachelor's degree in sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, and her master's and doctoral degrees also in sociology at the University of Arizona. Today, she is a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. Welcome to Segue with Dr. Markowitz.
Thank you.
Well, the first question I usually ask to faculty who come to this show is a very simple one.
Oh.
Why do you become a college professor?
See, that's not simple at all. That's very complicated. Because I think most people go into academia because they love learning. They believe in the institution of learning, and I think that was what motivated me as well.
Okay. Now, I read that the topic of your master thesis was on alcoholism.
That was my undergrad.
Oh, your undergrad?
Yes,
okay.
my undergrad.
So why do you chose that particular topic?
Family history. When I first got into undergrad, I thought, I want to be a pharmacologist and do experiments. And I actually had a job. My job was to experiment on rats, and I had to tattoo rats and actually gas the female rats and decapitate the male rats and do experiments on them. Yeah, so after a while I realized, my people are Jewish, I'm gassing rats, this is not good karma.
No.
So I got out of that.
That's what I was going to say. It doesn't look good.
Right.
Okay. Now, what do you learn through that research on alcoholism?
Well, the pharmacological stuff, what my main interest was deviance and criminology. And that's actually why I went to the University of Arizona to study with a very famous criminologist whose name was Travis Hershey. And he developed a theory called social control theory. And I realized, sadly, that I was a bit too rebellious to work with anyone, and I wanted to go my own way. So even though lots of people went to the University of Arizona to work with him, I got out of that field and sort of went to my own direction.
Okay. Now, the title of your thesis for your master's degree was Gender and Satisfaction in Power Imbalance Exchange Relation. Mm-hmm. What is all that all about?
So there was a professor at the University of Arizona named Dr. Linda Mulm who studied a theory called social exchange theory, and it's really a model about power and how power is structural rather than individual or micro-oriented, that when people get into situations of power, they're going to act the same, regardless of their gender, and that's indeed what I found. So that she did experiments, and she had people work in labs and engage in exchange types of interactions. And what we find is that regardless of male or female, when people have power, they tend to act the same way.
Now, one of the reasons why colleges and universities have as a policy that a amorous relationship between a faculty member and a student, even if the student is an adult,
right,
is forbidden because of that power imbalance.
Exactly.
What will be the major risks that will appear when that relationship is established?
And that actually, I study work in organizations too, and in terms of, I think there's a couple of issues. Number one, people who, if a professor establishes a relationship with a student, it can create tumult in the class for the other students who feel like they may be treated unfairly. And I think it, of course, adds to this sense of injustice that the professor may be treating the student unfairly. And also, students can't say no. They're afraid of saying no, of being in a relationship, because they're afraid they're going to get penalized.
Okay. Will you say that those are the only reasons why that kind of relationships should be forbidden, or there are other reasons why we shouldn't allow those relationships in colleges and universities?
I think the main reason is to protect students. And I think I think our policy even here at SIUE is, if you establish a relationship with a student, you need to sever any kind of mentoring relationship you have with that student. So they're not saying never. They're just saying you can't be in a position of power over that student, because then that student can't say no.
Okay. And then you went on to work on your doctoral dissertation, and then you changed topic again, and this time was about union organizing. And I was wondering, by reading this, how do you see the future of unions in this country? Because obviously the membership of unions is declining.
Right.
So how do you see that in the near future?
Union membership has been declining for many, many years. When I started my topic 20 years ago, there was a sense of doom among unions. And unions have tried to move into the service industry, and we've seen recently the service industry workers, McDonald's and other service industry workers in New York going on strike, actually all around the country. And I do think that even though unions can be very problematic, they're incredibly necessary. We wouldn't have the kind of wages we have now if unions didn't exist presently in some organizations, because in order for organizations to avoid unions, they make wages comparable to shops that have unions. And so even though the membership in terms of the private industry right now is fairly low, like maybe 9%, the reality is that 9% is maintaining the current conditions we have for all workers. So not only wages, but also the benefits you receive from working in a workplace. So I think unions are trying to maintain their survival, but I think if they do keep decreasing in numbers, it's going to be problematic for all workers.
Now, it's interesting because in certain industries, a number of corporations have made clear that if the workers want to work there, they cannot be unionized. And we see that a lot in the airline industry, where they say, well, if you want to work for this company, forget about a union. So I wonder to what extent that is being spreading around among different sectors of the economy.
Well, it's actually illegal for a company to say you can't join a union, or so that's totally illegal. That went out with the Wagner Act in 1935 when workers' rights were protected. So I think what organizations are doing instead is they're trying to convince workers that they don't need a union, that they have a great workplace, and that they have great benefits, and that a union will actually destabilize the workplace. And that's mainly the general way companies try to avoid unions, by either threatening to leave or, and that's illegal too. You're not allowed to do that. But they'll do it in very subtle ways, and by trying to argue that we don't need a union because we have all of the benefits already that we need.
Okay. Now, there is another part of the question here called worker activism. And it's interesting because sometimes you see places that have a union, but there is almost no worker activism, and other places where there's no union and there's a lot of worker activism. So I was wondering if after a union is established in a particular workplace, does worker activism become extinct?
That's a really good question. And that was sort of what I was interested in with my study, I was comparing two different organizations, one in which organizing strategies really taught unions how to be active, and one that was completely top-down. Most organizing strategies tend to be top-down, even organizing, where they'll go in and it's mainly the organizers doing most of the work, getting the card signs, trying to mobilize workers. And when that kind of organizing strategy exists, you tend to see workers who are not very active in the union. And the workers tend to feel like, well, what is the union doing for me? There's less of a collaborative experience or expectation and more of a very instrumental, I'm paying you dues, What are you doing for me? So I think because most organizing strategies tend to be top down, that is the experience once people get into unions, is unions tend to be bureaucratic. And it makes it difficult to be active. But also, sometimes workers are afraid of being active because they're afraid of retribution from the employer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, we have seen in the last few months, last few years, some states in the United States who are taking very active stances in order to diminish, let's put it that way, the influence of unions, particularly in education. And actually, some of them have been successful in doing that. So why do you think that has happened, given that areas like education tend to be heavily unionized, and still they cannot get away with that?
First of all, education, the education sector is public unions, and they have a very different set of rules than do private unions. And so they have much less power. In order to, let's say you wanted to strike, you have to actually jump through lots of hoops and let the the superintendent know many days in advance that you're going to strike. So they have a lot less power than do private sector unions that also have actually a lot less power. That's the big debate. In 1935, with the Wagner Act, when unions were protected, in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, and that actually made it illegal to engage in what are called wildcat strikes, which are incredibly effective. And wildcat strikes are when workers finally just get sick of it and they go on strike. Now you have to plan everything. It's like planning a fight. Like, imagine I'm going to get in an argument with you in a year, right? That takes all the spontaneity out of it and the power out of it. So I think that what we're seeing is a country that really devalues education, which also makes teachers have less power, and also bargaining rights that are very diminished in the public sector.
Yeah. Well, there's something interesting about the history of the labor union in this country, which is that Labor Day everywhere else in the world is May the 1st because of something that happened in this country. Right. But Labor Day in the U.S. is on the first Monday of September. Can you tell our audience a little bit about May 1st and what happened during that May 1st in the United States?
So the Haymarket riot, which happened, what was the date on that? 1860... In 1860s. Yeah. And so this was a time in the U.S. history in which industrialism was really new. So capitalism was quite a new thing. And so there was a lot of controversy of people leaving their farms and sort of being forced into these factories where they had less power and less control. And so a group of people called anarchists, and when we think of anarchists, we think they
bomb throwers.
Yeah. So and there was in the city of Chicago, there was an area called Haymarket, and a bomb went off, and some police were killed, and they pinned it on some anarchists, and they were actually hung. And so that's what sort of sparked the Labor Day movement all over the world, except for, I guess, here.
Yeah, it's interesting because I once heard someone saying that the reason why it's not celebrated in the United States is because it was a bloody day and nobody wanted to remember it.
Right.
Do you think there is some credence to that
Absolutely.
Story?
Yeah. I mean, even though now people don't even associate that day with the United States. Exactly. I mean, we think of Russia with May Day. Yeah. We don't even think, but absolutely at the beginning, that would be true, yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the things we have seen in the evolution of the labor movement and labor issues in general is this tendency to develop partnerships between labor, management, and government. Is that always a winning solution?
I think this country, labor laws prevent that kind of collaboration. We see successfully in Germany and Sweden relationships between government, industry, and unions. And in fact, in those countries, a majority of people are organized, maybe 90%. And they're very successful. We know that their production is very successful. They have a low unemployment rate. There's less economic disparity. So I think that that kind of collaboration is essential. But we don't have it. The labor relations in this country are established adversarially. Even if you wanted to work together, you couldn't. So structurally, we promote an adversarial relationship between labor and management. And I think that's why we have that as much economic disparity as we do in this country, partly.
Well, when you say adversarial, the first thing that came to my mind is lawyers, because that's the way law is understood in these countries, adversarial things. So I was wondering if lawyers were behind in the scheme of things, making this relationship adversarial in the United States.
I think the first thing, though, before that was the way the Wagner Act, the way the National Labor Relations Act was established. It was established adversarial. But it is true that unions they have lawyers now in it, and part of it is ensuring that contracts are fairly created and actually enacted. And so lawyers, I think, if you look at union leadership, a lot of people actually are lawyers now, so who've moved up high in the union leadership, and partly to ensure that workers maintain the little control that they have.
Okay. Now, when one reads news from Europe, you can see that there are strikes going on all the time.
In some countries, yes, like France.
Or Italy.
Yeah, France and Italy, yes.
Yeah. And sometimes for reasons that you say, really? You're having a strike because of that? But you don't see that going on so much in this country. Would you say that the labor movement in this country somehow is tamer than it is in Western Europe, in some parts in Western Europe?
Well, definitely. I think when you have an adversarial relationship, you tend to have high strike rates. But I think what we're seeing there is mass strikes, so groups of workers coming together. I think there's much less solidarity here. We have lots of different unions, and there's a sort of a divide and conquer consequence of that, where workers do not come as a collective together to fight an injustice. I think the most recent thing we've seen with that is the Occupy movement, which wasn't even started by unions. It was started by the rank and file people, many of them whom were unemployed. Yeah. And so there's a sense of collectivity in Europe that we don't have here, and partly it's because they have. I think they have workers there feel more entitled to government subsidies than we do here. We don't really like the idea of government subsidies, and I think that sort of sets us apart and makes us mistrust each other.
To what extent do you think that the part of that American psyche about individualism also makes the American labor union to be less, let's say, successful in garner people around? Yeah.
Actually, another unique history that the United States has that European countries didn't, although now they're starting to get like that, is race, the issue of race. And so racially, in this country, unions were very racist and sexist. And that has really kept people from coming together, too. And I still think that racism plays a part in why workers don't see their interests the same. I talk about this in class. It's like, why, workers, they have the same interests, and yet we see white workers often supporting management who they have less in common with than people of color. So I think a huge difference now is the fact that the United States was always the most racially diverse, industrialized nation. I think we're starting to see a little shift in that. England's becoming more racially diverse as we see immigration from Africa, people moving into Europe. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that, if race causes more individualization.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because, normally you can say that there are more things in common between poor African Americans and poor whites than it is between, let's say, poor African Americans and middle-class African Americans. But still, it seems that race is playing a more important role there.
Right.
So I was wondering if this has anything to do also with the fact that sometimes it seems that people who are poor vote when it comes to elections against their own interests by supporting candidates that obviously are not pro-labor. Is that something that has been studied?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think partly it's this belief that the Horatio Alger myth, in which people think, well, I'm not there yet, but I will be there. And so there's this desire to keep looking forward instead of focusing on the present and the reality of their situation.
Okay. Now, another topic that you have studied is ecotourism. And that, of course, is a very active industry, to call it some way, in developing countries where people go to watch nature or watching whales or whatever they want to do. And there is this thing that obviously the people with the local knowledge of nature are the local inhabitants, usually poor people, peasants or whatever. And I was wondering, out of your study on ecotourism, do we have a good sense of who benefits from that particular industry?
That's a good question, too, because I think it's going to depend on who's controlling that industry. So I think if the people in that in the community are controlling it, they do tend to benefit. But if it's outsiders coming in, people from Western countries, we don't see that sort of trickle-down effect of the people from those communities benefiting. So instead, we see a co-optation of the land, a co-optation of the knowledge, and so it really depends on who's controlling that kind of industry.
Okay. Another topic you have studied is also feminism. And of course, we hear a lot about feminism in the 70s and 80s and women's power and all that kind of things. You don't hear so much about that lately. Yet, the inequities for women in this country are enormous in terms of salary, in terms of protection, in terms of harassment, you name it. Why do you think is the reason why that particular movement is not stronger, given those inequalities that we are facing today, or women are facing today?
Actually, I was just talking about this with my students, and I think the third wave of feminism tends to be organized around identity politics, and when that happens, people become more individual in the identities that they adopt. So you might say, well, I'm a white middle-class woman, and I have interests that are separate from these other groups. So like in the first wave of feminism, which was the suffragist and the temperance movement, there was a unifying cause that mobilized everybody, that lots of people could agree on. The second wave, getting rid of the legality of paying men and women different wages, of making it legal to prevent women from getting into certain jobs. Those kinds of issues were also very much shared by lots of different groups. Now, I think the issues are much more splintered, so that women of color might feel, for example, that they want the right to be able to raise their kids in safe environments with educational systems that provide them resources to allow their children to have economic mobility, whereas white middle-class women might want to ensure that the glass ceiling is broken. So you have these different groups with different issues, and you don't have a unifying one thing that sort of keeps people together.
So what would you say are the most unconquered objective of the feminist movement that are still there to be achieved?
Well, I think what's interesting is that reproductive rights is slowly being chipped away, and I think that that's something that could be unifying and conquered. One of the things we know is, so the Equal Pay Act of 1964 made it illegal for men and women to get paid differently for the same job. But one of the things we know is that men and women oftentimes have different job titles, even if they're doing very similar work. So for a long time, the issue of comparable worth was a feminist issue. And that's the idea that men and women may be in different jobs, and we shouldn't even be looking at whether they're in the same job, because most of the time they're not. But we should be looking at the value of the job and paying the job what it's worth rather than who's in it. Because research shows that jobs dominated by women tend to get paid less than jobs dominated by men, even if the value of the job is comparable. So they're not doing the same thing at all. One might be a nurse, one might be a tech, but what we see is the gender that's dominant in the job tends to, if it's a man, tends to get paid more.
Okay. Now, with the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States, many people thought that we were going to move into a post-racial society. And many are arguing that that hasn't really happened. If anything, certain racial things have flourished again.
Yeah.
Do you think that if a woman is elected President of the United States, will that have any impact on the feminist movement of this country?
That's a good question. I think just like with Obama, there's pressure not to bring up race because there's this fear that, he's only going to help one group, even though past presidents have generally helped certain groups versus others. When it benefits white people, we tend not to get too upset about it. I think we'd see something very similar if a woman got elected, that people would be upset. She might feel a lot of pressure not to choose issues that would alienate powerful groups, people in power, which are generally white men.
Okay. Well, you have been covering a lot of different issues in sociology, which makes this a conversation very interesting. So in the minute and a half that we have left, I wanted to ask you, what is your next big project?
I've been working with a colleague in the School of Education. We've been looking at critical media literacy. We actually received a grant from the AAUW to develop a curriculum to teach to middle schoolers to try to instruct them about sexism in the media. And right now, we've been doing that. We really enjoyed teaching the kids. Somewhat. It was a bit stressful, actually. And so we're working on several papers about that. We had the kids actually construct a non-sexist ad, and then they had to videotape it. So we're looking at the ads, and we're writing a qualitative paper about it right now, and it's very interesting. So I think I'll probably stick with critical media literacy for a while and try to develop curriculum for primary education and how to get,
Did you find that those students doing that ad still show some, I would say, some hints of sexism that were not evident for them?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, they weren't hints. It was very difficult for them to not be sexist. And that was what was so interesting because we gave them a survey. And in the quantitative survey, it looks like they learned everything we wanted them to learn. So it looked great. And then we were examining these qualitative data, the videos, and we realized, we have a lot more work to do. And partly it's because people make sense of rational data fairly easily. But in terms of incorporating that into their own behavior, it becomes much more difficult. So we saw that, for example, students tried to distance themselves from their actions by poking fun. And anyway, it's very interesting.
Okay,
I think we have to leave.
Thank you very much to Dr. Linda Markowitz of the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Southern Illinois University for this conversation. And next week, we're going to have Dr. Adriana Martinez of the Department of Geography, who will be talking about the geography of water. So stay tuned.
This has been Segue with Dean Aldemaro Romero, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. All rights reserved, 2014.